question is about nirvana, but it's not a real question just about nirvana. The question is, what is Swami talking about in this book, Superconscious? A Guide to Meditation, Superconsciousness? Because he goes through this long discussion about nirvana. So a lot of times, not a lot of times, but sometimes when Swami's writing, he presumes, a lot of times when he's writing, he's using Master's teachings to answer classic conflicts in philosophy and religion that mere mortals like us may not even be aware of. So sometimes he'll be, because I know when he wrote this section about nirvana, which is on page 102 to 108 or something like that in this book. There's no index, that's why I say that. Although we have a little informal index that somebody did. He was very excited, and he must have been in the US at that time, but he called us, he faxed it to us, he told us on the telephone. He just thought it was so terrific. And I was happy that he was happy, but I didn't know what he was happy about. And what he was trying to reconcile is what he refers to in here, which is the fact that Buddhism has become dogmatic, like many religions have become. And there's apparently this sort of conflict between Buddhists and Hindus about nirvana, which is the state of nothingness as the Buddhists describe it, and samadhi, which is what the Hindus talk about, which is the state of bliss. And so that the dogmatic Buddhism says that they're seeking a state of nothingness, whereas the Hindus say they're seeking a state of bliss, and sometimes these two camps argue with each other. Now, Swami first of all says in here that Buddha himself Buddha did not invent the word nirvana. Nirvana had existed before him. And he himself was not in a state of nothingness. No one would have been attracted to him. He was a self-realized master, and therefore, again, as Swami says, if there is truth, there's simply truth. It's not like the Buddha can discover some absolute state of infinity that nobody else in an absolute state of infinity ever noticed. As Swamiji says, if there's absolute truth, there can only be one. That's the nature of it. So they all had to have been saying the same thing. And so what you then get into is, as Swami said, when an avatar incarnates, when a fully self-realized master incarnates, he has no karma of his own. But when he incarnates, he becomes defined, and to that extent trapped, by the karma of the times in which he chooses to incarnate, and by the specific karma of the disciples who are living with him, and that he has to help. He has to tailor his mission in order to help those disciples become free, or his mission is divinely designed in order to help those disciples. That's true of any great soul. I've watched Swamiji over the years just design his life over and over and over again to provide opportunities for the people around him. And I don't think he calculates it, but he's intuitively inspired to do this thing and to do that thing and to do this thing for the sake of the people around him. And he takes up all kinds of, I remember once there were about 20 of us at his house, everybody just working on a different project, and we all just laughed because this one man all by himself had just generated all these needs, so to speak, but the result of it was that all of us were just totally engaged in each one in an unusual way, because the divine energy was taking care of us. And that's what an avatar's life is like. So when Buddha incarnated, he was dealing with a particular kind of spiritual materialism, which was the inclination to propitiate the gods and do rituals and all of this thought about a kind of passivity. This is how I've understood. I am no expert. This is like a third-hand statement of this. But as I understand it, there was a great deal of passivity and just kind of a passive reliance on the gods. So that's why Buddha said God is not the issue. And his, as it degenerated over centuries, it became a dogmatic assertion that Buddha said that there is no God. But looking back on it in more truth, he said God is not the issue, which is different in the light of the mission that he was following. And so without my knowing, there must have been also something about that he was also correcting, which is why he chose the nirvana state which Swami describes it in here pretty clearly as saying, and again, these are just his words because I don't know these things, but he was saying that when you reach that state of absolute, of the awareness that you are solitary in the universe, everything is extinguished. Everything is extinguished because there's just you. But he makes that statement in here where he says that there's a pull, that there's almost a moment of anxiety in that, and then the state of bliss washes over you. And when he says later, he talks about Nirvana and Samadhi, is that Nirvana is that state when everything about you is extinguished. But just before, which is the step just before, you become one with all of the bliss and the love and the joy of the universe. But there's no logic to Buddha sort of defining his teachings as stopping at that point. Because why would it? I mean, there's no sense to it, and that's what Swami's trying to say. For Buddhists dogmatically to argue, which apparently they do, that the goal of life is nothing, is who would follow such a teaching? You know, it's only when you just sort of over-intellectualize it without really thinking about it that you can come into such a thought. And that's why in this book he talks about if the goal of life were really nothing, that would be suicide. I mean, and suicide doesn't really work because it doesn't really extinguish your consciousness. And as he says facetiously, that the only thing that means that nirvana is better than suicide because it actually works. Because, you know, when you reach nirvana, you actually are extinguished, but that's an impossibility to be extinguished. And that's, again, where he talks about you peel the onion until the onion disappears. But just because the form disappears doesn't mean that the consciousness disappears. So that's how I understood it when I read it. But I know why it was hard to understand. It's because it's the middle of a sentence. It's an argument we're not having. That he felt somebody was having with somebody. Does that make sense? Okay, that was because I cribbed just before I crammed just before I came here tonight. I can put that down. Because I remember at the time, I got it at the time, but then I immediately put it out of my mind. I have never chosen to teach out of that book again. So. But the interesting thing about him drawing in suicide is you remember in, I think it's The Path, where Swamiji says to Master, if you need to become completely non-attached from this world, then are people who commit suicide liberated? And Master laughed at that because that's the sort of logic, that's the illogic of the logical mind. And then he said, no, there must also be a positive, embracing desire for the uplifted state of consciousness. There cannot merely be a negating of this state. And that was, in this place last week and on Monday, I was talking a little bit about realizing that of the battle of life being that everything ultimately will have to disappoint you because otherwise you would still desire it and you would keep reincarnating. But the battle of life is to just find the heart of joy in the midst of it no matter what. And on Sunday when we were talking about that Bible phrase, be still and know that I am God. And some of you were here and I was trying to talk about that. I didn't feel like I got it across that clearly because I don't understand it that clearly. But I just could see that if you still all of the waves of likes and dislikes, whenever you become completely still, you discover that no matter what has happened to you, there's always a level that is untouched. And I've shared with you, as a child, my yogic samskars, my impressions from past lives as a yogi, caused me as a little child to often solve my childhood traumas by what I would call it, I just keep going into myself until I found the place where I was still okay. Because I would just I could feel as a child that I would back up from what was happening until I found the spot basically where it wasn't happening anymore. You know, and it wasn't a wrong thing, it was a yogic thing, I just didn't know what it was. It was always a place where it wasn't happening, and in the place where it wasn't happening, everything was fine. And the goal of life is to be still enough in all of the ups and downs to be able to feel that so that you can come back out. Not so that you can just stay there, but so that you can come back out into everything else and not worry about it. Not be concerned about it. Not even be disappointed when it disappoints you. Just of course that's the way it is, because the joy is from somewhere else. That's what meditation is about. That's what Kriya is about. That is the essence of meditation, is the daily, twice daily practice of withdrawing to the point where nothing else is happening, except that which is eternally happening. And that's why meditation is so fundamental to being able to do this, because otherwise the mind alone just isn't strong enough. It has to be an actual experience that can hold. Otherwise, it's just too hard. Does that make sense? I don't know if that relates to Nirvana, but I thought it did. I don't remember now how.
Somewhat
Yes.
related. Does Swami talk about what are the ideas of God with form and God without form? Is that part of Nirvana discussion?
I don't know. I mean, Swami Master answers the question of God with form by saying basically he's both, that's all. I mean, it's formless and form. That's what's Ramakrishna's answer. Depends on which side you're standing. Where we stand, it helps. And it's very hard to, as Swami says, it's very hard to open the heart to something that doesn't have some kind of focus. And without opening the heart, it's very hard to move forward spiritually. So I did what we're going to answer.
Well, I had a question.
Here you go.
About letting go, about releasing things. Tips, tricks, techniques.
You mean when it's not going to...
Just any thoughts about that? Any
Well, you have to generally... I mean, what you're saying is when you have some preoccupation that doesn't go anywhere, I presume is what you mean. When something isn't going to happen and one holds on to it, or when one is just obsessing about something that... Life is like that. I feel a little bit like Lucy sometimes, in the Charlie Brown cartoons, when she plays the psychiatrist is in, Charlie Brown comes in and says all the problems, and she says, "You're no different than anyone else," and asks him for 5 cents. That was her dream. The mind is a monkey. It's just a monkey, and when the monkey gets a hold of things, especially things that have involvements in the nether regions of oneself, where you just don't know what's moving you, and you often have the feeling that here we are again with whatever karmic problem it might be. I mean, it takes a long time to overcome things. I remember once, I try to blot it out of my mind, but I still remember it. I was washing dishes at Swami's house, and it was just a very casual moment before he remodeled his kitchen at all. And it was, for those who've been in Crystal Hermitage, the kitchen was on the platform, basically where the piano is now. And I was washing dishes, and there was this little ledge, and he kind of leaned over and just put his elbows on the ledge, like it was just most casual, and said, he said, Master speaks about being able to get liberated in one lifetime, but I mean, how much progress can you actually make in just one incarnation, he said, like that. And then he sort of laughed and walked away. I don't know why he said that to me at the moment, but I remembered it. How much progress can you make? And I thought, oh, Lord, this is not what I needed to hear. But I think he was also just trying to say, be patient with yourself. Don't be so hard on yourself. It doesn't serve anything to be hard on yourself. Because that's a problem that many of us are prone to, including me and perhaps you, to be just hard. Like, spend a lot of time wanting ourselves to be different than we are. And that is not going to help. I mean, tips for changing, it doesn't help to just wish that we were working on a different problem than the one we're working on. I think it's helpful to take whatever is really troubling you and just figure this is mine for now, instead of just always being in a state of rebellion. That's not the same as saying, I accept this delusion forever, but it's saying, well, this is the delusion that I'm working with, instead of wishing that I could get rid of this delusion so that I get onto a different delusion. Humility is very helpful in the spiritual path, because once humility is about becoming honest. Swamiji says to be humble is simply to be honest. To just see things as they actually are. Because once you see things as they actually are, you see the cosmos as it is, and then where's the pride? And so just accept that, well, this is a most embarrassing state of consciousness, but this is mine. And I want to be working on something more impressive, but this is actually what I'm working with. It's just this, tiny little, minute by minute, foolish preoccupation, which all of us have. I think you can do Kriya to get rid of a delusion. I found that if you inhale the delusion up and offer it up to the spiritual eye, and exhale and leave it there. Push it and move away from it as you exhale. I find that that's very helpful. As long as that thought doesn't get you more wrapped up in it. But that's a way of just doing it. But you have to do it over and over. And you can literally feel, as you're working with the Kriya current, that you're burning the karma in every chakra where it is. Okay, for those of you who don't have Kriya, it's just a question of visualizing the chakras and visualizing the divine light just burning. You can literally do a fire ceremony, which is very helpful. You can do it mentally or you can do it literally, and that's very helpful. Then you have to treat the obsession like a poison. But the worst thing about obsessions or preoccupations or desires that are frustrating desires is that they're pleasurable. It's the scratching of a mosquito bite. I remember having poison oak, and it's just awful to scratch it, because as soon as you scratch it, it just gets inflamed. But sometimes you just scratch it. It's so foolish and so incredibly bizarre to watch yourself scratch it, because you know that you're just creating hell for yourself, but still, it feels so good to do it just for that moment, And then you have this whole chain of events, which is just a nightmare. But still, that one moment of doing it was worth it. So that is a problem with holding on to things, is that we like it. So I kind of think if you're doing something pleasurable that isn't really that pleasurable, that you should try to milk it for all the pleasure it's worth. You know what I mean? Just try it out, and then put it aside as quickly as you can. And then to replace it is the things we've talked about before, which is japa and affirmation. Because what I was going to say is, you have to treat it like an enemy, which is hard to do because it feels like a friend. It's sort of like having a companion who's a bad influence on you, but you don't want to hurt their feelings. So you have them around all the time, even though they're a bad influence on you. So you have to really persuade yourself that this really isn't helping me, and that's hard to do. So as long as you think it is helping you, you'll keep entertaining it. Or you just have to in myself, I just kind of get this kind of, what is the word for it? I can't exactly think how to, I'll try to describe it. It's kind of like I try to have a parallel existence. It's like I have this vibration going on over here, and I know it's going on over here, and then I try to have a life over here. And I just kind of try to have them exist on a parallel track, in the hope that sooner or later, the good one will overcome the bad one. There was an image that I remember from many years ago. This was actually an image about why karma yoga helps liberate you, why service liberates you. It's like your delusions are it's like a drag race between two automobiles, And they're just racing along side by side, and the delusions are just going to keep racing, and you just have to keep putting energy into the other car, and you'll finally reach a point where you'll cut them off, you know? But you'll just run parallel for a long time, and finally you'll get ahead. And yes, you just have to outlast them. I mean, things go on for years. I don't mean to be discouraging, but they do. I've had certain negative preoccupations that just lasted for years. I mean, years and years and years. Positive ones too, but negative ones especially. Just years and years. And years. And years. And then someday they're gone. And you've outlasted them. Devotees may come, devotees may go. That's why the second verse, to me, that's what the second verse means. I may go far, farther than the stars. To me, that means I may go way out into all kinds of delusions, but I'm still going to stick with my spiritual life. And therefore, I'll make it through to the end.
The Buddhists call it habitual mind.
Habitual mind.
Which kind of helps.
Yeah, it's
If
habitual
you know
mind.
it's habitual thought, then some part of you can pull away from it, even though, like you say, it's 2 tracks.
It's parallel tracks. But see, it's just habit. The other thing to realize is really, no, it's not, well, it is habit. I mean, there's a kind of habitual thought which is true. There's also deeply held karmic inclinations, which are also habits. No, habit is really what it is. But the energy it took to build them up is going to be the energy it requires to take them down. And theoretically, if you could generate all that energy, you know, if you could generate 500 lifetimes of build-up with one powerful blast of your will, Master says theoretically you can. That would be great. But usually it takes longer. But Kriya is the shortcut, you see, because one round of Kriya is like 1 year of living. So if you do Kriya to free yourself from your delusions, every round of Kriya is like 1 year of outlasting. And that's why Master says it's such an extraordinary technique for self-realization. So even if you're not literally offering up your delusion, with each Kriya, you can start your Kriyas by saying, I dedicate these Kriyas to expunging this particular karmic inclination. And for those of you who don't have Kriya, just dedicate your meditation to that. I dedicate my meditation to overcoming this delusion. And let's particularly work to root out these thoughts.
Well, the only question I would have then is, what chakra would be associated with attachment?
All of them.
Well,
The heart is where likes and dislikes live, but it depends on what the nature of the attachment is. I don't think it's I don't know if you can really say it's in this chakra, you know, because there's anything, we're complex beings. Unless you just have a really strong feeling, it certainly doesn't hurt to meditate in the heart. And the higher Kriyas, of course, relate more chakra by chakra, and I do find that that's very beneficial. So, if you feel it, you know, if you feel it in the heart, then focus in the heart. But it's everywhere. I mean, that's why Kriya is a continuous round involving every chakra. That's why when we do the Oms and the chakras here, we go up and down, because it's a whole, and it's not only that, but by going up and down the chakras, with even the Oms as we do them, you're creating a vortex. It's not merely that you're focusing in and burning out a particular thing. You're creating a current of energy that becomes a magnet that, see, you create an inner current and it draws your consciousness in from the outside. So that's what you're doing by going up and down. And that's why people say, why do we go down also? Because before you can go really deep, you have to create it's like you have to launch yourself like that. So you're creating that vortex which draws your consciousness in from outward awareness. And so you can visualize what you're attached to as being on the very periphery, you know, like being on your fingertips, instead of being deep in yourself and you want to pull back from it. Does that make sense? So that's more helpful than just one chakra necessarily, unless it's really, really clear to you. Did you start to say something, Rick?
So I just think you might as well get them all.
Yeah, you might as well get them all. Yeah.
You said earlier in Another Heart to Heart that this path doesn't believe in euthanasia.
Uh-huh.
But at what point does medical science interfere with?
That's right, you asked me this.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
At what time does medical science interfere with what would be considered the natural
Right.
process?
Right. Yeah, we had talked about, just to bring other people up today, we had a discussion about organ donation and euthanasia, led into euthanasia. Just to repeat the first part of it, Swamiji has spoken quite strongly against donating your organs because in order for them to be useful to someone else, they have to be harvested while there's still life force there. And he said, if you're that moment, that period of transition between life and death is a time when you want to be letting go of the body, but you're still identified with it. And he said, if they come in and start hacking it to pieces while there's still a fragment of your consciousness there, it could be very, very disruptive to your transition because you're still a little bit involved in it, and if they start cutting it up, you'll be inclined to become agitated about it at a time when you want to really just let it go. So despite the fact that it sounds very generous, it came up because his mother was planning to do that, and he just pleaded with her not to. And she heeded him because he was so insistent on it. And then afterwards, I think Vivian asked the question about euthanasia. Everything has to be tempered with a degree of common sense. And all of these things, euthanasia particularly, comes from the idea that there's no divine harmony and no divine intelligence happening. And that unless we're having pleasurable experiences, our experiences are purposeless. I mean, because that's what it's about. Or it's like to avoid suffering it's fundamental to avoid suffering. But it's not fundamental to avoid suffering. It's fundamental to avoid ignorance. And suffering as a result of ignorance is the serious suffering, not suffering as the result of physical disability. Sometimes extreme physical circumstances are exactly the catalyst that's needed to give you the energy to rise above a certain level of consciousness that you would never never have enough power to rise above, because nothing would force you to rise above it. Also, we need to have constant challenges to the soul's identification with the body in order for us to recognize that the soul is far more, the soul exists independently of the body, and that our consciousness is not defined by the body. So when the body begins to deteriorate or begins to suffer, that's often the golden opportunity. In fact, it may be the entire point of the incarnation, is to have the body disappoint us or cease to be what we want it to be, so that we can be still and discover who we really are. So merely to have reached a point of terminal illness, for example, and say, well, that's it, could be very foolish from the point of view of what you really are trying to learn. Now, I say we have to apply this with common sense, too, from the fact of what people may have done in their lives or assisted other people to do. A lot depends on your intention. If you don't really understand and then take action, even suicide or abortion or other ways of ending life, and you don't really know what you're doing, there's not that much karma attached to it. You learn later, and then you recognize what you did, but if you didn't understand at the time, it's different. Euthanasia gets complicated because of the fantastic capacity of medical science to keep the body breathing. I know Happy Winningham, who had AIDS and lived 8 or 10 or 12 years, I don't know, quite a long time with AIDS, and had to work very hard to stay alive all that time, and did not always feel really terrific. at a certain point she asked Swamiji, when should I stop trying? And he said, he said, at the point at which you can't do Kriya anymore. That's his answer. He says, when you can no longer use the body for a spiritual purpose, then there's no point in holding on to it anymore. And there's a difference between, continuing effort after effort to keep the body alive and taking a bunch of pills and ending it like that. If you just let it die, that's different than saying, I'm going to die in 15 minutes, like that. If it's I'm going to die in 15 minutes because you have the capacity to leave your body, that's different, Like Master, died at the end of the poem. That was the moment he stopped his heart and he died. If you have that capacity, you can die anytime you want because you're in command. It's different. But to just let it go and saying, I'm not going to make an effort to keep this body anymore because it's done. I'm finished with it. That's not quite the same as what people call euthanasia, at least not the way I think about it. And I think, Daniel Brinkley, who's really big in the hospice movement, said, and actually I've heard this from other sources too, he said, I think it was 70 or 90 cents, but I think he said 70 cents of every dollar in America spent on medical care is spent in the last 6 months of life to extend life an average of 14 days. And he said in the whole, he might have said 90 cents out of every dollar, he said the whole crisis of medical care in this country doesn't really exist. Because if we stop doing that, then the whole finances of medical care would change. And he also said in those 14 days will be the most miserable of your existence. Because they're just at a time when you're just wanting to let go and be calm and be quiet. One of my friends, as her mother was dying, they came in and took chest x-rays. Because, I don't know, they didn't want to be sued, really. Or they wanted one more chance to have a bill. She was dying. She died, an hour and 2 hours later. They all knew she was dying. They were taking chest x-rays. Why? Because there's absolutely no understanding of death. Nobody gets death. So a natural acceptance of death. Bella Bingham, there was no more treatment but for her. She had breast cancer. There was nothing else that she could do. And she sat down with Sue Loper Powers, who was a doctor, a nurse, and she just talked about what her options were. Did she want to be force-fed? Did she want to be hydrated? What did she want? She decided that she would take liquid, but she didn't want any food. And she just made the decision, just calmly, and then lay down or waited, and then about 3 weeks later she died. Because there was nothing left to do. Why just struggle to live another 14 days or 1 year? Swami often says about his father, who had a heart attack, and they rushed him there and saved him, and then the next year of his life was absolutely miserable. And if he had just been allowed to die at the point that he had that first heart attack, it would have just been fine. Maybe he did learn something. But even that was like, he was at the end of his life, and the quality of his life just completely disintegrated after that. Whereas at the point that he had the first heart attack, he was doing well. What is the point? So, I think even at that point it's questionable whether it's worthwhile. But it's just a decision of, I just don't need to keep this body. I've had enough of it. It's not a question of, I'm afraid, or I think it's purposeless, which are sort of different points of view. I was so distressed, for example, when Pritike, that man who did all that wonderful work with heart, he got liver cancer or something, and then he took his own life. He was in the hospital, and his life had deteriorated to the point where he couldn't do the things he was used to, and he took his own life. I thought that was so sad. But I sort of felt all the good karma he did for helping so many people will certainly mitigate it. It seems like a small mistake compared to how life-affirming his life was. But he was still, his definition of life was so physically oriented that when he saw the death of that, he couldn't stand it anymore. Yes, Leslie?
This is kind of putting a new definition to the phrase, you die when it's your time. And with what you're saying, it's more of our free will does play into our time.
Oh yeah, sure, our free will plays into our time. On many, many levels. Especially with the medical choices we have. And I always call it life greed. There's just sort of this greed for life at all costs, and there's this belief that without the body you're in, there is no life, which is foolish. So if you just have a natural acceptance that everybody grows old and dies, then it's more obvious what you need to do. It's just it's intuitive. And when people are afraid, and I remember a man came to me and he was very distressed because his mother wanted to commit suicide and she wanted him to get the pills because she had some disease or another and she didn't want to go on with it. And he asked me what I thought he should do, and I told him I would not want to be part of that. That's all I could say. I just wouldn't want to be part of it. See, I lost the thought. Oh, I said far better to try to help her be unafraid. That's what you really need to help her, is to just try to transfer to her some of your calmness about the end of life. But I don't remember what it's like. I don't know what it's like. I certainly have had some direct experiences of aging and illness, and it's pretty horrific. So it's no small task. That's all I can say.
Can I give you just a couple of examples to get your take on it? My grandmother died at the age of 95. She had certainly completed, a long, fulfilling life. She had a stroke. She happened to have it while she was talking to me on the phone. And so I'm the one that got her to the hospital. And afterwards, when I realized she was partially paralyzed, she had, she couldn't speak. And when she found out that she couldn't go back to her home, that she would basically be in a nursing home for the rest of her life, she wanted to die. And she did ask me, would I help her die? And at first it worked when I said, well, if I did that, then I'd be sent to prison. And you don't want that to happen to you. And she goes, no. And then as a little time went on, and I used that answer, she goes, I don't care. I knew she was getting more desperate. And what finally happened was she decided to refuse eating, refuse food, but still take liquids. And she then came down with pneumonia. She had told my father and myself that she didn't want any medication, certainly nothing to, extreme to help keep her going. And she had pneumonia. Well, and pneumonia is considered, it's like the godsend for old people because it will take them when otherwise they could be kept going for years and years and years. And I found out that they had snuck penicillin into her beverage without her consent. And my father had actually gone to the doctor and said, we honor, her wishes, no medication, blah, blah, blah. Well, I was not a happy camper. And needless to say, everybody else knew I was not a happy camper. And they stopped giving her medication. 3 days later, she died of pneumonia. And
no, I think that's exactly fine. I don't see that as euthanasia. That's just a person of their own free will saying, let nature take its course. Let's not interfere anymore. But it's just that very thing. She didn't interfere. She didn't take her life either. She just said, I'm finished. The Eskimos used to just go out on the ice. The old Eskimos, if the food was scarce or they just couldn't keep up anymore, they just wander out into the snow and just let them, give up the body deliberately because enough is enough. That's a conscious. I think that's just fine.
because you are making a choice at that point
to not interfere, is what you're saying.
Right.
You're just letting nature take its course. And you could get well. She didn't have to get pneumonia. She could have recovered. She was just not interfering. I don't think merely because medical intervention exists that it's suicide if you refuse it. That's what we want to say. I mean, I don't know what I myself would do, but I've seen 3 friends, go through horrific cancer treatments and die at the end of it. 2 friends. And so I wonder, 3 actually. Was it worth it? What would I have done? I don't know. But I don't think it's necessary to take the treatment if it exists.
That was going to be my next example. What if somebody, young and still could potentially have a long life to live, and they have massive cancer, and the treatment is to go for chemotherapy, which is going to debilitate. It will debilitate your body beyond the fact that you're fetus.
Right. But that may be temporary.
That's true too.
That may be temporary.
That's true too.
I think it has to be intuitive at that point. It just has to be an intuitive sense of whether I need this to cure and whether I want to cure. I mean, another friend who died, she refused the treatment. She started I don't know when, she refused the treatment. She started getting sick, and then when she got so sick and couldn't really make her own decisions, people started giving her the treatment. Then she started getting well enough again, because she was having the treatment. When she got well enough again and realized they'd given her the treatment, she refused it again, and then died. But then my other friends took everything that was in the book, and they died too, so who's to say? You know, I think it's really personal.
And so that's not necessarily going against the spiritual.
No, I think you have to make up your own mind. Because people die when they're treated and people are cured when they're not. You know, it's just, it is what it is. But Swami himself says he wouldn't be here, but he's had, you know, he's a walking pharmacy. I mean, he takes a bazillion pills every day and they all keep him alive. He's had enormous heart surgery, he has a pacemaker, he has 2 titanium hips. I mean, he's just a walking advertisement of all the things that they can do. He says actually, in fact, that the heart thing has left such a long-term trauma that he said he wasn't sure he would do it again. Because it's had a permanent effect on him. But at the time, he did it and he wouldn't be here if he hadn't done it. So, because he squoze an enormous amount of God-serving work out of that body for pumping it up and keeping it going over and over again. You know, we wouldn't have a lot of the books we have if he hadn't done it. Or music. I mean, he's done a huge amount since he had that surgery.
Asha,
Yeah.
in your family, like with your mom and dad, if they get to the point where they really can't make the decisions, are you the person who makes the decisions for them, or do you say yes to doctors if they're needed, or no, let's let them go? Or how does it work? Because I'm going to face that sooner or later with my parents also.
Well, they both left a living will, which, you know, gives me guidelines as to what they want, which is sort of mid-range.
It's
mid-range. I mean, it's not do everything possible no matter what, nor is it, you know, leave me in peace. It's sort of just a little bit in the middle. But yeah, I'll have to make those decisions, and my feeling is that there's no point in keeping their lives going if they look like they're going out. You know, I may feel differently at the time. I've never had to make that decision. But it seems to me that they're old enough, they've lived long enough. I don't have life greed.
Right.
You can actually, when you're of sound body and mind, you can actually do a legal directive that says, I do not want blah, 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 blah. My grandmother did have that.
Yeah.
And I had it in my possession that if I ever needed it with the doctors, I could say, this is what she wants, I honor her with that.
Yeah, and I have the same thing, but I think it's more intuitive. When Happy Winningham, who had AIDS and had been into death and back again so many times, and she was in the hospital in Sacramento, and she was just way out there. I didn't see her, but she was bloated up. She was unrecognizable. And she'd left it in Michael Gornick's hands to decide. And he was real. I mean, she was so sick, and yet she'd been there and back, you know, several times through his experience, and they were going to have to pull the plug. Because everyone was saying that they needed to, but he was the one who had to decide. And he decided he would wait until the next morning or something like that. And he prayed really deeply, and he really prayed to Happy. And he was going to make a decision at 8 in the morning, and at 5 in the morning, she woke up. And she rallied for a few hours and just kind of talked and was there, and then poof, died. So it was sort of like she responded to his prayer. And so these are the kinds of questions where I think in the moment you have a sense of what you need to do, whereas you can't necessarily know. But in principle, I think it's better to jettison a body that's just a nightmare and just get out to one that functions again.
I've got an older sister, and I've got a sister who takes care of both my parents. And it's going to be mostly me and them trying to work out. And I don't have a lot. To me, it's just like they kept my grandmother alive for 4 years with no legs for no reason at all.
Except not necessarily. See, the other thing you have to stand back and realize is that some other person's attachment to that person is also part of what has to happen.
Yeah. Right.
And so someone else's attachment, like in this case, Robert's talking about his sisters and their relationship to his parents, which you're implying they're going to have a different attitude about it, both because of their philosophy, but also because of their karma. And I see that, looking at my own relatives, I see that whereas I may feel finished and ready to let someone go, other people who are close to them may not feel that way at all. And for me, I made this mistake very seriously when not that, fortunately I didn't have any influence, but I made it in my mind when I was with Paula. And Paula was dying and I was there. I was somehow impatient for her to get finished, even though it was a very short cycle. I realized part of the reason I was impatient is because I had to leave, and I didn't want to leave, and I had to leave. I mean, it was the stupidest thing. It's amazing what comes, what you really are motivated by. But I also just finally, at a certain point when Durga turned to me and said, actually I was sitting with Danny and we were both off balance. She said, stop trying to control this. That's what she said to us. And then I realized that everybody, there were so many people there and they all had relationships that had to be worked out. And just because I personally wasn't engaged in that did not mean that there wasn't very good reasons for this to go on until somebody else had finished some whole cycle. So that's why you can't just think in your head what ought to happen, or else you'll make the kind of mistake I made where you're pushing out of some theory and you're not really feeling what's really going on here, which is just that it's just going to take what it takes. And if a grandmother lingers for 4 years, but at the end of it, she's worked out some important attachments, or somebody else has worked out important attachments to her, that's time well spent. And nothing is going to keep a person in the body, even medical science, unless there is a soul reason for it. Even though it looks like it's just medical science, there's a soul reason for it. There has to be. Because death is simply not in the hands of the doctors. Period. Yes, Gloria.
Well, in that regard, can you speak to how relatives, I'm speaking of myself in particular, how do you find a sense of peace about that, or whatever, when you watch for years and years and years, like parents, elderly parents, linger and have no life at all, and just the sense of despair when you witness them just giving up because their lives are so sad.
But this is the same question we've talked about many, many times in here, which is basically, why do people suffer and how do you deal with suffering?
But it's about finding peace within yourself when you're witnessing something.
No, I'm just saying it's the same question. It just happens to be your family, and it seems like a different question because it's your daddy or your mom. But it isn't. It's the question of whether or not there is a divine intelligence running this universe, and whether every individual in it is part of this perfect web. And there really is no other answer. Believe me, I don't think this is simple. And I'm caught just as much as you are, and I've had some very, very difficult experiences over these last couple of years. I know how hard this is. But I can't think of any other answer. And I also realize that oftentimes, and this is also part of why people, I think, sometimes need to just finish their natural course, even if at a certain place they choose it to end. But oftentimes you go through something very difficult and you don't really realize what it was about until after it's over. I mean, hasn't that happened to pretty much everyone? I mean, whether it's a year or even a 20-year cycle, you just don't know what it was about until you finished it. And I think a lot of people who end up in very odd or difficult circumstances at the end of their life may not have the capacity until they go to the astral world to understand what it was about. Because it may just be karma on very deep levels. Or it just needs to be, I certainly know in myself that my karma has to get really, really exaggerated before I notice it. Just inclinations, habits, things that have been driving my husband crazy for years, But I just don't know it. I just am not aware of it. And then it gets really bad, and then all of a sudden, oh, I understand. This has been going on for, 30 years, and everybody around me has been trying to tell me. But it has to just reach a certain peak before I get it. And usually, often that's a peak of suffering of some kind, not always. And so a person who's had a whole life that hasn't worked because they've made a whole bunch of terrible choices, and the end of it is this, there's really nothing you can do, because they have to learn what they have to learn. And then it becomes a test of detachment. Now, I find this very difficult too. There's people in my life, I feel their sorrow so acutely I can hardly bear it. And it's just a constant and very, very difficult challenge. It's very, very difficult, and I have to just either not think about it, or just very, very rarely think about it. And then I just try with as much courage as possible to just try to use all the philosophy that I know to say that Divine Mother is in this, and that there's joy at the end of it. But I find it heartrending. And all I can say is just keep on keeping on. There's really nothing we can do. Think how the masters must feel. In terms of sorrow. They suffer. Master says in one of his wonderful poems, when I am only a dream, he said, I will weep for you through my eyes and perhaps through your eyes too, when I see you straying from the path of self-realization. The masters just watch us slice ourselves up with knives all the time. And it makes them very sad. And we watch the people around us just living life in such a way that they suffer. The only thing that helps me at all, and it doesn't always help me, is that we don't help them when we get pulled into it. The only possible way we can help them is to remain calm. But I think it's very hard, Gloria. And I think it's the biggest challenge that life brings us, is what I started, is to stay happy in the face of it. Kriya, meditation, devotion. I've been very calm for the last several years between my own family situation and all that Ananda's been through. And this few weeks ago, I'm sick of this. I used to be a very happy person. I am sick of this. This oversensitivity and this person and the world and the angst and the this and the that. I said, this is not being a devotee. Being a devotee is to be joyful. And I just recommitted myself to joy. In the face of it, it's not going to go away. So why let it kill us? And it's not easy. Swamiji often says, joy is a deliberate choice, and it takes tremendous willpower to have it. And we just have to recognize that's what we're here to do. Otherwise, I know what the other side is like. You know it, I know it. It's day after day after day after day. And you're just not worth crap to anybody then. You're just walking around with this big sense of the way the world is. You're not helping a thing, least of all yourself. That doesn't mean it's easy, but what choice do you have? It's sort of, I'm saying that's a pep talk for me, because I'm trying to get back out of it myself.
I like the balance that you brought this past Sunday with what Yogananda said about that it's our religious duty to face difficult situations. It's our religious duty. And I love the way you talked about it on Sunday, that it's so important to go through situations into what's happening on the other side, be it a positive or negative situation. But you drew wonderful examples about the positive, and that was really wonderful. We're just kind of always riding between those extremes, it seems sometimes.
What Sharon said, you have to go through it. That's exactly, I forgot what I'd said. I try to look at people who are suffering, and I try to look right through it. That's what Daniel Brinkley does. I talked about that in here not too long ago. He just looks right at it, and just tries to feel the divine right through it. I find that's better than all this shrinking away from it. Because shrinking away from it, it's still got a hold of you. Just look right at it. Oh, this wonderful person, this poor soul is just so caught up in their delusions, but they'll get out of them. I know they will. You know, just right into it. Yes.
As I thought about death and dying, I think it'd be very difficult in my life that I feel I have completed whatever I can complete if I were to die at this moment. And I was thinking that I should really be looking at being prepared all the time, being at certain spaces when I'm not going.
Well, of course you ought to be. You need to be prepared to die at all times. Every night, Yogananda said, you should surrender everything back to God. You should build an inner bonfire and absolutely everything, because when you die, you don't want to be thinking about it. At the same time, and you also need to live as if this was your last day. What are we waiting for? You'll die the way you live. So the way you're prepared to die is to live. And to live according, the best you can, according to what you know to be true. And there's no way around it. I can't, it's a little bit late for me to answer this as completely as I might. I remember a friend of mine, he heard that, you know, if you die thinking of the Om, then it'll help uplift your consciousness. So he had this idea that he would have a tape of the Om, and when he ended, I'd put on his earphones, and he'd listen to it, which actually was more clever than I realized, because that's even what the masters say, is that you should chant Om around dying people so that they'll hear it. But eventually you can't hear anything anymore, although hearing is the last to go. Your consciousness will be the habit of the mind. So if you want your mind to go someplace uplifted at death, you have to look at what it did this morning. Because it will do, at the hour of your death, exactly what it's been doing all along. It won't be any different. And so the degree to which you are out of alignment with yourself, with the world, with the people around you, with your creativity, with everything, you'll just be exactly that much out of alignment. And at the time that you die, it's the right time, you know, and so something else happens, because you have a perception all of a sudden of, oh, I see, this is just the way it had to be. Because finished, unfinished is only an illusion of this world. But I think we should be preparing for dying all the time. I love dying. I mean, I love the idea of it. I mean, I think it's extremely useful. I think it's extremely useful. It's a great, it keeps us honest. I can't say more than that because I don't have enough time tonight. If you want to bring it up again, if you're here again. Maybe we should open and see if we can. How's this lady? She's doing her version of the Hong song. All right, let's chant Om at the chakras.
First chakra, the coccyx.
the spiritual eye and feel the power of your own will as a channel for the Masters, filling that prayer request with divine energy. And then let us expand our prayer request to be a ray of light that goes out from here to bless all those in need.